The morning of the 20th of December, 1941, the skies over Kunming in southwestern China. 10 Japanese Kawasaki Ki-48 twin-engine bombers crossed the border from French Indochina, climbing toward a city that has not yet been touched by the war spreading across the Pacific. Below them, on the ground, civilians look up and see something new in that sky. A formation of stubby, snub-nosed fighters diving out of the clouds, each one painted with a wide, snarling mouth of white teeth and a single glaring eye above it. Within minutes, 3 of the 10 bombers are burning wrecks on the ground. The rest turn back for Hanoi and never return to bomb Kunming again. It is the first combat mission ever flown by the American Volunteer Group, a unit history would soon nickname the Flying Tigers, and it is the first time most of the people on the ground below have ever seen that shark's mouth in the air at all. Pause on that. A single afternoon's dogfight over a Chinese city, 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor was even attacked, is not usually the kind of thing an entire theater of war organizes its visual memory around. This is not a story about one intercepted bombing raid. This is the story of a piece of nose art, borrowed from a photograph of somebody else's airplane, painted onto fighters flown by American pilots who were not even officially in the American military yet, that went on to become one of the most recognized and most feared images of the entire war in China and Burma. Part 1. The shark's mouth did not originate with the Flying Tigers at all, and the honest version of its story has to start somewhere else entirely. The design first appeared on German Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters of Luftwaffe Unit ZG-76, painted on the aircraft's nose during fighting over Crete and the Mediterranean, a snarling mouth without an eye above it. Royal Air Force pilots fighting the same German aircraft in North Africa encountered that design directly, and after being re-equipped with Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks in July 1941, fighters coming off the very same production line building aircraft for the American Volunteer Group being recruited for China began painting their own version of the shark's mouth onto their new fighters, eventually settling on a definitive design that became closely associated with the squadron's nickname, the Shark Squadron. An American Volunteer Group pilot, Charles Bond, saw a photograph of 112 Squadron's shark-mouthed Tomahawks on the cover of an Indian magazine, and the design was adopted for the AVG's own aircraft soon afterward, with one addition that would become the version most people picture today, an eye added above the mouth, a detail the German and British originals had not included. The Bf-110s that first wore an unsmiling version of the same design over Crete belonged to a unit whose own pilots were, by most accounts, simply borrowing a menacing shape long associated with sharks and predatory fish in maritime folklore, applying it to an aircraft that already carried a fearsome reputation of its own as a heavy fighter capable of overwhelming lighter, less well-armed opponents like the Gladiator biplanes. RAF 112 Squadron had originally flown before converting to the Tomahawk. There is a certain irony in the fact that the same basic image traveled from the aircraft that had been beating the squadron in the air, borrowed onto the very type of aircraft that squadron then began flying itself. Part 2. The men flying those newly painted fighters were, in the strictest legal sense, not part of the United States military at all. Claire Lee Chenault, a retired Army Air Corps officer working as an aviation advisor to the Chinese government, organized the American Volunteer Group in 1941 by recruiting serving American military pilots to formally resign their commissions and sign private contracts to fly for China instead, a legal fiction that let the United States support China's air defense against Japan without officially declaring itself a combatant, months before Pearl Harbor forced the issue anyway. Roughly 100 pilots and several hundred ground crew and support staff made up the 3 squadrons that deployed to Burma and China through 1941, technically employees of a Chinese government contractor, flying American aircraft, defending the Burma Road supply line that kept China's war effort against Japan alive. Chenault's recruits came almost entirely from the ranks of serving American Army, Navy, and Marine Corps pilots, men who had to weigh giving up a military career and its protections for a private contract flying combat missions over a country the United States was not yet at war with, an unusual gamble that paid considerably better than their previous service salaries, but carried none of the legal protections a uniformed serviceman would have had if captured. Ground crews recruited under the same contracts faced the less glamorous task of keeping aircraft flying with limited spare parts, in primitive airfield conditions across Burma and southern China, work that received far less attention afterward than the pilots' combat records, but that made those records possible in the first place. Part 3. What made the P-40 dangerous in the hands of these pilots was not raw maneuverability, where it was consistently outclassed by the lighter Japanese Army fighters it faced, the Nakajima Ki-27 and later the Ki-43, in almost any slow, turning dogfight. What the P-40 offered instead was superior diving speed, tougher construction, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating the more agile Japanese fighters generally lacked in this stage of the war. Chennault built his entire tactical doctrine around that specific trade-off, drilling his pilots to avoid turning fights with Japanese fighters altogether, diving on formations from above, making a single fast pass with guns blazing, and extending away using the P-40's superior weight and dive speed to escape before a more nimble opponent could turn back onto their tail. The same basic energy versus maneuverability logic American naval aviators would later apply against the Zero itself. The Ki-43 Oscar, the more capable of the two Japanese Army fighters the AVG faced regularly, would go on to become one of the most produced Japanese aircraft of the entire war, and it shared with the Zero the same basic design philosophy: extreme lightness and maneuverability purchased at the direct cost of armor and self-sealing fuel protection. That trade-off made both aircraft devastating in a slow-turning fight, and surprisingly fragile once an opponent found a way to avoid that fight altogether. Exactly the vulnerability Chennault had identified before his pilots ever engaged one in combat. Part 4. That doctrine was on full display during the group's combat debut over Kunming. Chennault positioned one squadron at an altitude where the approaching Japanese bomber crews could see it clearly, drawing their attention, while a second squadron waited higher and out of sight, ready to dive once the bombers had committed to their approach. The tactic worked exactly as designed. 3 bombers went down, the rest broke off, and Kunming was not seriously threatened by Japanese air raids again for some time afterward. It was a small engagement by the standards of the wider war soon to engulf the Pacific, but it was the first time the shark-mouthed P-40 had done in real combat what its paint job seemed to promise. The 2-squadron trap Chennault laid over Kunming that first morning depended entirely on ground-based radio and observer networks the Chinese had spent months building along the likely approach routes from Japanese-held territory, an early warning system crude by later wartime standards, but sufficient to give the AVG's fighters enough notice to climb to altitude and position themselves before the bombers arrived, rather than being caught on the ground the way so many Allied air forces elsewhere in the Pacific had been in the war's opening days. Part 5. The wider combat record the American Volunteer Group compiled between that first mission in December 1941 and its dissolution the following July has never been pinned down to a single, universally agreed number, and this channel would rather say so plainly than repeat one wartime claim as settled fact. Some tallies credit the AVG with roughly 115 confirmed aerial victories and around 300 additional Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, against the loss of only about a dozen of their own aircraft in air combat. Other contemporary and post-war accounts cite considerably higher aerial claims, into the high hundreds once unconfirmed victories are included. Wartime kill claims on every side of every conflict have historically run ahead of what post-war cross-referencing against enemy loss records can actually confirm, and the Flying Tiger's own record is no exception to that pattern. What is not seriously disputed is the direction of the imbalance. A badly outnumbered volunteer force flying an aircraft that could not outturn its opponents consistently came out ahead against Japanese fighters that could. It is also worth being clear that the AVG's most productive fighting happened against Japanese Army aircraft over Burma and southern China, not against the Imperial Japanese Navy's Zero, an aircraft flown by a different service in a different part of the theater, and one the AVG rarely, if ever, encountered directly during its brief existence. Popular retellings sometimes blur the AVG's record together with the wider mythology that grew up around the Zero later in the war, when in fact the two stories belong to almost entirely separate chapters of the Pacific Air War, fought against different aircraft, different pilots, and different Japanese services. Wartime propaganda offices on the American side had every institutional incentive to publicize the higher end of the AVG's kill claims, rather than the lower, more conservative estimates, since the Flying Tigers had become, almost from their first engagement, one of the most useful morale stories available to a country not yet fully at war. A small band of volunteer pilots beating a supposedly superior enemy against long odds. That incentive does not make the higher claims false, but it is exactly the kind of institutional pressure that historians weigh carefully when a war's own participants are also the ones compiling its most celebrated statistics. Part 6. It was against that backdrop that the Shark's Mouth itself became one of the most photographed, most reproduced pieces of aircraft nose art of the entire war, recognized by Allied newspapers, Chinese civilians, and Japanese forces across the China-Burma-India theater alike as the signature of a specific, unusually effective unit. This channel has not been able to verify a single documented, named account from a Japanese airman or ground observer describing personal dread specifically tied to the site of the mouth itself, as distinct from the unit's broader combat reputation, and it would rather disclose that gap plainly than invent a quote to fill it. What can be said with confidence is that the design became, and has remained for 8 decades since, the most recognizable visual shorthand for American air power in China during the war, reproduced on models, posters, and later aircraft, precisely because it had already become instantly identifiable during the war itself. Nor was the Shark Mouth itself unique to the Flying Tigers, even within the American forces that eventually wore it. The 23rd Fighter Group that inherited the AVG's aircraft and personnel after July 1942 kept the design on its own P-40s, and decades later, when the United States Air Force designed a new close air support aircraft built almost entirely around a single massive rotary cannon, its own pilots chose the same snarling shark's mouth for the nose of the A-10, a direct visual inheritance stretching from a German heavy fighter over Crete, through a British squadron in the Egyptian desert, through Chennault's volunteers in China, to a jet-age attack aircraft flying close support missions 8 decades after Charles Bond first spotted that magazine photograph. Part 7. The honest accounting of this story separates 2 things that are easy to blur together: the paint and the tactics. The Shark's Mouth did nothing to the aircraft's actual performance. It could not make a P-40 turn tighter or climb faster than a Ki-43. What made the aircraft wearing that paint genuinely dangerous was Chennault's disciplined refusal to let his pilots fight the kind of battle their opponents were better at, paired with an airframe just rugged and fast enough in a dive to make that discipline pay off. The fear the symbol may have inspired, to whatever extent it was real rather than legend, was earned by tactics and airframe durability first, and only carried by the paint job second. A distinction this channel thinks is worth making rather than letting the more visually striking half of the story stand in for the whole of it. The eye, added above the mouth on the AVG's version, absent from both the original German design and the British Squadron's version that directly inspired it, may be the single most consequential artistic change in the whole chain of borrowing, since it is that added eye, more than the teeth themselves, that gives the American version its distinctive, almost cartoonish menace, the detail most people picture first when they think of a shark-mouthed fighter at all. The American Volunteer Group's own service ended on the 4th of July, 1942, dissolved as the United States formally absorbed its air effort in China into the regular Army Air Forces, forming the China Air Task Force, and eventually the 23rd Fighter Group, which inherited both the shark-mouthed P-40S and the tactical doctrine Chennault had built around them, continuing to fly and fight in the same theater under a new official flag. Chennault himself, the man who had organized the group as a civilian advisor, was recommissioned into the Army Air Forces and continued commanding American air power in China for the rest of the war, eventually retiring as a major general and remaining involved in Asian aviation ventures until his death in 1958. Charles Bond, the pilot who had first spotted the photograph of 112 Squadron's shark-mouthed Tomahawks and helped bring the design to the AVG, survived the war and lived for decades afterward, one of a shrinking number of men who could say they had painted the design onto an American fighter for the first time. None of the pilots who first climbed into shark-mouthed P-40s over Kunming in December 1941 had any way of knowing their aircraft's paint job would outlive their own unit by 80 years and counting, appearing on aircraft types their own war had not yet imagined. They were, at the time, simply mercenaries under private contract, flying an aircraft most of them had not chosen personally, trying to protect a supply road in a war their own country had not yet officially joined. Chennault's tactical manual, drafted before most of his pilots had ever fired a shot at a Japanese aircraft, drawing entirely on Chinese combat reports and his own analysis of Japanese fighter design, rather than any personal dogfighting experience against them, turned out to be close enough to correct on its very first outing that it remained the group's standing doctrine for the rest of its brief 18-month existence, changed only in detail rather than in its basic logic of diving in, shooting once, and leaving before the fight could turn into anything resembling fair. Whatever fear the shark's mouth genuinely produced in the men who saw it coming out of a Chinese sky, it was a fear the aircraft's paint scheme merely advertised rather than created, borrowed twice over from other air forces before it ever reached the airframe most people now associate with it, and earned, in the end, by a discipline of tactics its designers back in Germany, or its early adopters in the Egyptian desert, never intended it to represent at all. Kunming civilians, watching that first engagement from the ground on the 20th of December 1941, had no way of knowing they were witnessing the opening minutes of a legend still being repainted onto new aircraft 8 decades later. They simply watched 3 bombers fall and the rest turn back, and for the moment, that was reason enough to look up without fear the next time strange fighters appeared overhead. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More symbols and stories borrowed, copied, and reinvented across different air forces and different theaters of the same war, and more units whose real reputation was built on unglamorous tactical discipline long before any paint was involved. The shark's mouth first appeared on a German fighter over Crete. It found its most famous home on an American fighter over China, in the hands of pilots who were not, technically, supposed to be fighting there at all.